In April of 2026, something happened that many thought was impossible. After 16 years of building his, quote, illiberal democracy, Viktor Orbán, who was arguably Europe's most dug-in and controversial leader, was just swept from power. And this wasn't just another election. No, this was a geopolitical earthquake, a complete reordering of the political map in Central Europe, with aftershocks that were felt all the way from Brussels to Moscow. You know, as soon as the results were clear, the reaction from European leaders was, well, it was immediate and it was ecstatic. This quote you see here from the European Commission president, it wasn't just your standard diplomatic nicety. It was a massive collective sigh of relief. For years, Orbán's government was like a permanent handbrake on EU policy, always a disruptive voice and one that often seemed to be singing from Moscow's hymn sheet. This wasn't a comment, it was the sound of a huge obstacle being cleared from the path.
And this chart, wow, this really puts the sheer scale of the change into perspective. What you're looking at isn't just a political shift, it's an electoral tsunami. I mean, look at this. In 2022, Orbán's Fidesz party had a stranglehold on power, 135 seats. Just 4 years later, that number craters to 55. And then this new Tisza party, led by Péter Magyar, comes out of literally nowhere to win 138 seats. It is a complete, total inversion of power.
138. I want you to remember that number because it is the key to absolutely everything that comes next. It's so much more than a victory. It's a tool. You could even call it a political weapon, one that could be used to dismantle a 16-year-old system from the inside out. And here's why that number is so powerful. 138 seats gives you a constitutional supermajority. See, in Hungary, the magic number is 133. If you get 133 seats, you can actually change the constitution itself. With that kind of power, the new government can start to unwind the entire legal architecture Orbán spent more than a decade building. We're talking about reforming the judiciary, changing media laws, pulling out entrenched loyalists. It is literally the power to start a constitutional revolution. So, the big question is, how did this happen? How did a leader who seemed completely unshakable, a man who built a political fortress around himself, get swept away so completely? Well, if we look at the anatomy of this upset, we can see 6 critical fractures that brought the whole thing crumbling down. The collapse really began from the inside. First, there was a presidential pardon scandal that just shattered Fidesz's image as the protectors of so-called family values. That was then amplified by simple economic fatigue. People were just fed up with stagnant wages and seeing their state hospitals fall apart. At the same time, Orbán's very close ties to Putin became a huge liability, especially after the invasion of Ukraine. But really, the final blows were tactical. The opposition, led by Magyar, ran this modern, high-energy social media campaign that just ran circles around Orbán's old-fashioned playbook. And crucially, it brought out a new generation of voters who all demanded one thing: systemic change. So in the end, this election really became a referendum on 2 completely different futures for the country. On one side, you had Orbán's vision, this illiberal, nationalist state, deeply skeptical of the EU and very friendly toward Russia. And on the other side, you had Magyar's platform, which was all about a return to Europe, a crackdown on corruption, and a promise to restore the rule of law. And, well, the voters made a very, very clear choice. But here's the thing. While this was a Hungarian election, you could argue the biggest loser was hundreds of miles away. So let's dig into that and look at why the shockwaves from this vote are being felt most intensely inside the Kremlin. This data really shows you just how much of an outlier Orbán's Hungary had become. Look at their approval of EU leadership. It was right down there at the bottom, among the lowest on the entire continent. And that's exactly why Hungary was so valuable to Moscow. It was a reliable internal saboteur. So for Hungary to suddenly rejoin the European mainstream, that's a major strategic blow to Russia's long-term goal of dividing the Union. And this loss couldn't have come at a worse time for Russia, a moment of extreme vulnerability. Just look at these numbers. By April 2026, the war in Ukraine has cost them an estimated 1.2 million casualties. Military spending has exploded to nearly 10% of GDP, while the economy has basically flatlined. All told, the country has lost about 1.5 million people, either killed, wounded, or they've just fled. The entire system is under immense strain. And that's really the heart of it. Right at this moment of profound weakness, with its economy and its military stretched to the absolute breaking point, the Kremlin lost its Trojan horse. It lost its single most effective political asset inside both the EU and NATO. And the strategic setbacks for Moscow are immediate, they are concrete. First off, the loss of the veto. There's a crucial €90 billion aid package for Ukraine that Orbán had been blocking for ages.
That's now expected to go through. Second, an intelligence blind spot. That back channel that was allegedly feeding confidential EU secrets to Moscow, it's been cut. And third, Russia's energy leverage is now seriously at risk, with a full-blown review of that massive POX-2 nuclear project on the table.
But look, a historic victory like this isn't the end of the story, not by a long shot. For Péter Magyar's new government, winning was actually the easy part. Now comes the real challenge. They have to navigate the political and economic minefield that Orbán left behind.
And the challenges they face are just gargantuan. Priority number one is to unlock 18 billion euros in frozen EU funds. And that's going to require some immediate, probably painful reforms. Then comes the absolutely monumental task of dismantling a captured state, basically rooting out Fidesz loyalists from the courts, from state agencies, from the media. They've also got to renegotiate these incredibly complex Russian energy contracts to get some real independence. And they have to do all of this while rebuilding alliances in Europe and juggling pressure from both Washington and Beijing.
So, a new era has undeniably begun in Hungary, and, by extension, in Europe. The promise of a full return to the democratic mainstream feels very real. But the path forward is littered with the explosive remnants of the old regime. So the central question is this. Will this be a swift, clean return to Europe, or is Hungary just beginning a long, arduous slog through a geopolitical minefield?